Hello and welcome back, my commanders, cerebrates, and executors to the StarCraft Lorecast, the podcast where we dive into the lore, stories, and interesting and fun facts about the StarCraft universe, a favorite RTS franchise of us all. I'm your host, Jeremy. I hope you're ready to dive back in. So this week we'll still be continuing on our arc of exploring the races found within the Milky Way galaxy and that call the Kupulu sector home. Kupulu. God, I keep messing that up. This week we're going to touch on the second race that we're introduced to and that we play as within StarCraft 1. So, hope nobody has a fear of any bugs or creepy crawlies, because if you haven't guessed it yet, we're going over the Zerg today. Everyone's favorite cute, cuddly, and hungry bugs that love to get, So, most of what we know from the Zerg originally came from our understanding of the Zerg swarm itself back in StarCraft 1. This would change about when the Heart of the Swarm expansion would release for StarCraft 2 back in March of 2013. This is where we're introduced to the origins and home of the Zerg itself. So a lot of this may be, I guess, repeated or talked about again once we go down into different sorts of factions and sub-factions within each race itself. But hope you guys enjoyed the content either way. So for now, let's continue spreading the creep and learn about the history of the Zerg race itself. So the Zerg is a terrifying and ruthless amalgamation of biologically advanced anthropodal aliens dedicated to pursuit of genetic perfection. The Zerg relentlessly hunt down and assimilate advanced species across the galaxy, incorporating useful genetic code of their own. They are nicknamed the Swarm due to their ability to rapidly create strains and the relentless assaults they employ to overwhelm their foes. Now, alongside the Protoss and the Terrans, the Zerg stand as one of the three dominant species of the Milky Way galaxy and are universally feared, hated, and hunted as such. With the Swarm itself making up a third of the power of the Kupulu sector, the Zerg remain in areas of the galaxy outside of the Kupulu sector as well because they weren't native to it, they did invade it. So, yeah, the Zerg, like I said, most of what we know comes from the swarm itself. So we'll go touch into a bit of history about the Zerg. So how were the Zerg created? Where did they come from and whatnot? How were they brought about into its current incarnation? So let me read you off a little quote from Zervan. From this primordial place, the Zerg arose. Within, one essence split into many. One devoured another and became stronger. The first of the Zerg, when he speaks about the first spawning pool on Xeris. So the Zerg were native to Xeris, a hostile ash world near the core of the Milky Way, one of many worlds seeded with life by the Xel'Naga. They arose from the catalytic fluids of the first spawning pool on Xeris. Inside the pool, a single essence or genetic. What happened was, they kept, if you play Heart of the Swarm, you'll see this spawning pool. That's how, spoilers alert for a game that's over 10 years old, or probably about 13 years old now. Kerrigan would go to Xeris and find this spawning pool to regain her power and form as the Queen of the Blades. So, just like how single cell amoebas and how life started on Earth through the oceans, where, you'd have single cell organisms who would split off, either hunt down each other, or would eventually evolve into the land-based species as we know today. That's if you follow the science and biological history of creatures here on Earth. But eventually, Amon and his renegade Xel'Naga would come to Xeris and would discover the Zerg itself. At this point, the Zerg were still miniature worm-like insectoids, similar to the larvae of today's Zerg, and seemingly would be the most insignificant life forms on the planet. However, their genetic versatility and psionic sensitivity caught the Xel'Naga's attentions. Amon would take particular interest in the Zerg's ability to steal essence, as he sought to manipulate the creations of his brethren in order to create an army that could end the Xel'Naga's infinite cycle. This infinite cycle merged two species, one with purity of form and one with purity of essence, and would guide them to the Xel'Naga so they could impart their essence and give rise to a new generation who would continue the cycle. Amon and his followers viewed this cycle as flawed and desired to create a single master race that would end the cycle by exterminating all other life. So, Amon saw the Zerg as ideal candidates for the purity essence after they imparted the purity of form on the Protoss. From their orbiting world ships, the Xel'Naga spurred the Zerg's evolution through protogenetic manipulation. The Zerg would survive and thrive, evolving into parasites, burrowing into more resilient creatures, feeding on nutrient-rich spinal fluids, and finally gain control of their hosts. So at this point in time, the Zerg weren't like a species all on their own. They would more parasitic at this point in time, which I guess you could technically still call them parasitic and whatnot. But the Zerg biochemistry would evolve by assimilating genetic information from their host species, and the Zerg would utilize their new bodies to manipulate the environment. Only the most evolutionary advanced species were made host and assimilated. Lesser species would be eradicated. And the Zerg ensured they remained the dominant species at all times, steering the evolution of assimilated species, mutating them to have armor-piercing spines, razor-sharp limbs, and ultra-dense carapaces. Xel'Naga were shocked by the rate of mutation, because within a few generations, the first eliminated species were unrecognizable, and all these diverse Zerg strains would end up becoming a unified species. Now, at this point in time, the Zerg were still in their primal form and weren't a hive mind-like species that the Zerg swarm would become known as. So, specifically what Zervan would say. He desired our strength, the ability to steal essence, but we were independent. We would not follow. And so he bound the Zerg to a single overriding will. They lost their identity and became his slaves. So, like I said, they were still primal. They didn't have any hive mind or Zerg. Amon sought to override this. So the Zerg were united in their drive to evolve, but were still individuals. Amon's Xel'Naga remembered that personal pride and ego had sundered the Protoss' collective consciousness, leading to the Aeon of strife and their estrangement from the Xel'Naga. To avoid a similar situation or type, the Xel'Naga would create the Overmind to regulate the dangers of differing egos, thus beginning the foundations of the swarm that we see today. So the Overmind started as a semi-sentient representation of the Zerg's basic instincts and evolutionary drive, but would evolve into a sentient intelligence. He would create the Cerebrates, giant versions of Zerg Lavra, to help it control the swarm, with each Cerebrate given a specific task and control of a brood. As the swarm would expand with new species, the Cerebrates turned to queens and overlords to help manage their broods. Although the Overmind possessed intelligence, it did not have free will. Instead, gave the Overmind an overriding directive to seek the assimilation of the Protoss, thus creating the perfect species that would end the infinite cycle. Now, Amon and his Xel'Naga faction would seek to make the Zerg non-individuals, but this wouldn't actually happen to all the Zerg, because you still had quite a few that would hide enough and would be strong-minded enough that they would escape assimilation within the swarm and being subjugated by the Overmind. These would become the Primal Zerg and would live on Ceres, and the Primal Zerg would regard the Swarm Zerg as corrupt. So, spreading to the stars, the Zerg evolution eventually approached the limits of Ceres' biodiversity, with the Overmind realizing the swarm would need to leave the planet to seek new life to assimilate. So it extended senses into space, detecting enormous spacefaring organisms, and lured them to Xeris with its psionic abilities. These organisms were assimilated in the swarm as behemoths, and the swarm strains soon evolved to survive in space. The milestone was seen by the Xel'Naga as proof that the Zerg experiment was a success. Now, the behemoth is what you would are bigger type leviathans. So, we'll probably go deeper into them when we dive into the specific units or forms of each race. Now, during this time, Amon and his Xel'Naga were discovered by the other Xel'Naga faction resting in Ulnar. They would come into conflict in space above Xeris, and this war would ultimately culminate in Amon unleashing the swarm upon his own kind. And so it ended up, the Overmind basically was notified by Amon, hey, there's a bunch of aliens and stuff up here, go and feed, assimilate, whatnot. So it would sever its psionic link with the Xel'Naga, rendering its creators blind to its actions, and, as Amon intended, would launch the swarm into orbit against the unsuspecting world ships. The relentless Zerg attacks overwhelmed the defenders within an hour, laying waste to the Xel'Naga fleets and consuming most of the Xel'Naga with their knowledge. The Overmind would then proceed to process thousands of sentient minds to grow them more powerful and incorporating the energies of the Kadarian crystals into itself. Its creator's knowledge of evolution and progenetic physiology was used to improve the sentience of many strains without losing control. In spite of this, though, some of the Selnaga escaped the calling of the Zerg and banished Amon and his followers into the void. Of importance to the coming interstellar journey was the Selnaga's knowledge of other species they had influenced. From within this knowledge, the Overmind would learn of the Protoss and the general location of Ire on the galactic fringe. In spite of Amon's banishment into the void, the Overmind carried out the directive for which the swarm was designed. Perfection drew the assimilation of the Protoss. Although the Overmind would understand Amon's ultimate goal would destroy the Zerg, it was incapable of disobeying its directive. With Amon and the swarm gone, the primal Zerg would thus reclaim Xeris for themselves and would live undisturbed until the events of StarCraft 2, Heart of the Swarm. So yeah, that's how the Zerg would get its start, would form and come out into space and whatnot. They would thus journey across the stars trying to find Ire and head in its general direction, and would, even though they couldn't find the Protoss quickly, they would send out deep space probes to locate new species, of which the strongest would be assimilated. Despite these improvements, the swarm would still lack a true answer to the psionic powers of the Protoss, which, the Protoss were a good foil against them. But this would lead to the events of 2439, which prior they would spend an age swarming the fringe of the galaxy. But within 2349, deep space probes of theirs would end up finding the Terrans and would lead them down into the Prulu sector. Yeah. Then you'd get into the events of StarCraft 1, where the Zerg are, invading the Caprulu sector, the Terran Confederate is trying to find them off and whatnot, yada, yada, yada. The Overmind would capture Kerrigan, putting her inside a chrysalis to begin her transformation into the Queen of Blades, the second strongest will within the Zerg swarm itself. But the Overmind created Kerrigan without the link to Amon, because he wanted the Zerg to be free of that influence and free of the machinations of Amon. But yeah. But this would all lead to the Overmind learning the location of Ire after Ceratol would kill the Cerebrate known as Zaz. So, yeah. The Overmind would be killed at the end of StarCraft before the Brood War, drawing the swarm into disarray and causing it to splinter. But they would still have, the Zerg would still remain on Ire itself, taking over the world and whatnot, and forcing the Protoss to withdraw to Shakuris, the homeworld of the Nerazim. The Brood War. So, death of the Overmind plunged the swarm into civil war. Dagoth led other Cerebrates into merging to form a new Overmind on Char. In the meantime, they controlled most of the broods. Kerrigan and most of the remaining broods opposed them, and Kerrigan would seek to destroy the new Overmind before mature and getting control over the entire swarm and herself, and to take control of the swarm. And before the Brood War started, Kerrigan would dispatch the Kul Khan brood to Bekar Road to secure herself in the temple. The attempt ended in disaster, but release of the energy creature was a sign of events in motion that would culminate a few years later. And then you'd have the events of Brood War itself, with the United UED Expeditionary Fleet, which would take control of the Overmind and would proceed to try and take control of the Cthulhu sector. This would end up having Kerrigan cooperate with the Rainer, and he would procure the aid of the Protoss to fight off the UED. All in all, yeah, they would destroy the new Overmind, and Kerrigan would thus take over the swarm, driving off the UED and the Protoss and the rest of the Terrans off of Char and out of Zerg space. But the Zerg would withdraw after this, destroying the UED fleet as well, and retain the worlds they had infested, and we'd enter into an interbellum period. So, fighting continued between the end of the Brood War and the start of the Second Great War, even as the powers withdrew to recover. The swarm refrained from overt hostilities against the Terrans and Protoss and engaged only in occasional skirmishes. The swarm destroyed all expeditions to its worlds, And the UNN and other Terran news services that covered general threats did not report on the Zerg during this time, and observers could only speculate on the swarm's strength. Of the few that entered Zerg space and returned, trying to gauge Kerrigan's goals, they ended up with more questions than answers. At some point, Jim Raynor attempted an attack on Kerrigan, trying to make good on his vow to see her dead during the Brood War. However, this attack would fail. The Swarm would seek out new worlds and species to infest and would utilize spies to collect Zelnada artifacts. 2502, the Zerg were estimated to have infested over 100 worlds. 2503, the Swarm attempted to capture archaeologist Jake Ramsey while he carried the consciousness of Protoss preserver Samara. Ramsey and Samara also interested the other powers, and the resulting clash allowed them to escape the Swarm. During this time frame, new strains were created. The Baneling was bred from the attack on the Terran colony of Sorona. Kerrigan's visions for the Swarm, all Cerebrits would be destroyed and would be replaced with the Brood Mothers. These Brood Mothers were made to involve their broods and respect only strength. These qualities exacerbated the fragmentation of the Swarm during the Second Great War. Renegades and Ferals. The new Swarm was created by the Cerebrate Kaloth as an experiment in human Zerg hybrid leaders. Kaloth resurrected and infested Alexei Stukov, who would lead this new Swarm as a conglomerate of Zerg and Renegade Terrans on Brexis. The new Swarm would not last long, dissolving when Stukov was temporarily disinfested by a Protoss nanite serum, which was delivered by Jim Raynor. Stukov was given to the Mobius Foundation so they could study the nanites, but the nanites would fail and the infestation returned. He would be experimented upon. Zergon Ire remained part of the Swarm, but it did escape the strong control. And they would regain some of their own intelligence, but were still less vicious and focused, and they did not reproduce, which hampered the Swarm operations on Ire, not Zerg. Prophecy would pop up that Kerrigan Zertol would chase after, which would, state the end times or the apocalypse war, however you want to call it. This would all lead into the events of the Second Great War or the events of Wings of Liberty, and I think a little bit of the first part of Heart of the Swarm. No, would lead to all of Heart of the Swarm. My bad. Trying to remember all this off the top of my head sometimes. Which Kerrigan would then reinvade the Terran Dominion space and try and collect these artifacts that Jim Raynor would collect. Now, after Jim Raynor would collect all these artifacts, they'd go down to Char for the final battle of Char, which they would utilize these artifacts to disinfect Kerrigan and would take her off of Char. And the Terran Dominion would thus set up a permanent base on Char to keep control of the Swarm. This would cause the Swarm to break apart with many different broods and the brood mother/queens, claiming control and trying to continue fighting. In the end, though, after the de-infested Kerrigan would be taken to an Emotion research station where she would rekindle her relationship with Raynor, but the Dominion would attack, causing her to flee, and the UNN reporting that James Raynor was dead. Now, don't know about you all, but if I heard the death of a loved one at the hands of an enemy I hate, i.e. Arcturus Manx from Kerrigan, I'd be a little bit pissed and would want to go after the guy who claimed he killed him. And to be honest with you, that is what Kerrigan did. She would go back to her own personal Leviathan utilizing Raynor's personal dropship. And she would regain control of her brood, would go and conquer other broods like Zagara on Char, and utilizing the Adversary to enhance her intelligence, ultimately making the brood mother an adequate replacement leader for the Swarm. This would violate a long-standing imperative that prevented competition over the Swarm's leadership, which Kerrigan found acceptable. Kerrigan would then be guided to Xeris by Zeratul, and would thus go into a first spawning pool and basically infest herself to become the Queen of Blades, increasing her power by defeating and absorbing the essence of the other Primal Pack leaders, including Zervan. On the ice moon of Kaldir, Protoss Exposition Force killed Broodmother Nafash when she moved into the Ice Valleys. Later on, Kerrigan would arrive and reawaken her brood and destroy the expedition, first by destroying the Sidewing Spires and then the Arc Shuttles. The remaining Protoss were unwilling to give up, however, so Kerrigan planted a parasite into the Kali scientist Lasara as she was warped aboard the Dalim Ark. This parasite would evolve to become the broodmother Niadra, who would follow Kerrigan's orders and kill every Protoss aboard the ship. Who would, end up being left on that ship. She could no longer contact Kerrigan, the Queen of the Blades, and would be left to her own devices where she would find another world to crash on it in. Other brood mothers would gradually return to the swarm as Kerrigan's psionic powers and list of victories grew. Rejoining broods were sent to cripple Dominion's war efforts across the Kapulu sector. But Kerrigan would end up learning that Raynor was alive, being held hostage by the Dominion, but would be executed if the swarm moved on Core Hall. Now, in the end, Kerrigan wanted to invade Core Hall and kill Mix. Like any normal, rational person would want to do, but the guy who had demanded them to an alien intelligence that, would transfer you into a monster and claimed you killed the one you love. So, with the aid of Rangers Raiders, who would end up attacking Mirror's Marauders, getting back a person who could hack into the Dominion database and find out the prison ship that Raynor was on, i.e. the Moros, they would rescue Raynor. The swarm would also find new purpose at Skyger Station, home of the Dominion's hybrid protection program led by Dr. Nerud, finding its secret installation with the aid of infested Stukov and destroying it. Kerrigan would kill Nerud. Might not see it, but air quotes, killing. And learning of Amon's resurrection, Kerrigan would recognize the extreme danger posed by Amon, and the swarm would seek out and fight Amon, although she regarded this as a hopeless battle. But she wouldn't do that until after she finished up her stuff with Mex. So she would go off to invade Core Hall, but would utilize the Primal Zerg pack under the Haka, which she gained during her time on Xeris. They would destroy the Psi Destroyer, which would kill Zerg linked to Hivemind, and then would invade the Core Hall Palace, getting help by ranged raiders. And unfortunately, Kerrigan was being harmed by the Zelnaga artifact that Minx had retrieved, but Raynor helped disable it, and Kerrigan killed her. The swarm would then withdraw from Core Hall to wage war against Amon. Now, at this time, during the End War, Apocalypse War, however you want to call it, there was a Zerg brood under Amon's control. So, yeah. Zerg under Kerrigan's commands would successfully assault the Mobius Foundation base, whose personnel had come under the thrall of hybrids, successfully destroying it. Kerrigan would then send her broods to find the Zelnaga at Olnar. However, she found that the hybrid were already there. She began engaging in a battle against them the last days. On Ire, the Dalim launched an assault on the feral Zerg on Ire. However, the Zerg had already come under control of Amon's hybrids, and they began to use organized tactics against the Dalim. When Amon corrupted the Kala, the Amon brood fought alongside the corrupted Protoss and the hybrid in order to push Protoss off planet. The corpse of the dead Overmind was then used by Amon in order to begin construction of hybrid host body. The warp gate linking Shakurs to Ire was then reactivated, and the Zerg would flow through to invade Shakurs. Artanis and the Dalim arrived in time to evacuate the city, clear a launch base of Zerg infestation, but the Zerg presence on the planet had already hit critical levels. Matriarch Forzun refused to allow her planet to fall to Zerg and ordered the Zelnaga's temple phase matrix to be overloaded, destroying the planet, killing over 1 billion Zerg in hybrid in the process. Artanis would arrive at Olnar using the Keystone to guide him and would meet with Kerrigan. The two would attempt to release the Zelnaga, but found that they were already dead due to Amon's utilization of the Zerg swarm back during his war. Amon would then release a void portal in Olnar and begin flooding the area with void energy. Kerrigan would utilize her Zerg to take the brunt of void energy while Artanis closed the void portals. While the strategy was successful, Kerrigan's broods would be devastated. On Indion, Amon sent his broods to infest the moon, and where the Dalim were looking to reactivate the purifiers orbiting the moon. They would fight through the hives on the moon in order to deactivate stasis locks, shielding the warship Cybros, where the purifiers were located. Plan was successful, but Amon Zerg swarmed the platform with the help of hybrid, and Dalim would activate the purifiers who would purge the planet and the station. When the Dalim returned to Ire, Amon would use his broods as his first line of defense. The Zerg defended the first Kadarian crystal, firing the psionic matrix in Antioch, and Hives defended the third crystal in the Zelnaga caverns beneath Ire, but were overcome by the Protoss. Amon's brood then defended his master's host body when the Dalim assaulted it, but the void shards shielding him were destroyed. While Amon's host body was awakened, it was quickly destroyed by an orbital bombardment. The Zerg would then swarm the Dalim as they set up the Keystone, and were supported by the corrupted Golden Armada, which was not enough to destroy the keystone at the time. The Zerg on Ire were severed from Aemon's control. Yeah, so that's the basis of the End War. We had a lot of battles that happened between Aemon's brood, the Dahlin Protoss, and Kerrigan's brood. But this would all lead into the events of Into the Void, where would be the final battle of the End War. On Ulnar, Kerrigan would call the Raynor and Terrace, telling them of the benevolent voice in the void calling to her, and that Aemon still existed within the void, because even though his host body was destroyed, his consciousness and true body were left in the void, sealed by the Xel'Naga. The three would agree to destroy Aemon and utilized Ulnar's void portal to gain access into the void itself. Kerrigan and Stukov would lead the Zerg to free what they thought was Testar spirits from the Rood, and would break through his lines of shadows of the void to get to him. Stukov slew him, getting revenge for the years of torture inflicted on him. Testar's spirit, though, revealed itself to be the Xel'Naga Oros, who needed to ascend Kerrigan into a Xel'Naga in order to complete the infinite cycle and get the universe's chance at destroying Aemon. Which Kerrigan would begin channeling Oros assassins, but Aemon would send forces to stop it. Sagar led the Zerg to defend the eastern approach, aided by Raynor and Artanis. The defense was successful and Kerrigan ascended into a Xel'Naga. She would put Sagar in charge of the swarm and told her to remember the lessons she had taught her. Kerrigan would then lead the swarm in a final confrontation against Aemon, destroying the four crystals defending Aemon, supported by Jim Raynor and Artanis. With combined force, the void crystals destroyed and Kerrigan delivered the killing blow. So, and that would lead to the end of the entire End War between Aemon and everyone else, because Aemon wanted to kill all life in the galaxy like any other villain out there. So, a new queen. Upon returning to the Prulu sector, Sagar took control of the Zerg swarm. By 2508, she had seized control of charge in the world surrounding it. But before she left, Kerrigan would grant Sagar two gifts. One was the gift for her to choose the path the swarm would take. The other was the location of a creature that could house a Xel'Naga essence. Sagar took that essence she could from the Xel'Naga in Ulnar and put Abathur to work on constructing creatures that could house the Xel'Naga. Years later, fellow Zerg attacks began to hit Antigua Prime and Bountiful, drawn by the psi emitters placed by a separatist militia known as Defenders of Man. While the Dominion forces were slow to respond, Defenders of Man successfully evacuated these colonies, claiming the Dominion was too slow and weak in the face of the alien threat. Meanwhile, the Dominion investigated the incidents, discovering the Defenders' goals, but not before they released the Zerg on Borea and Terrador 9, leading to massive loss of life. The Defenders in Dominion were able to repel the feral Zerg. The Zerg would also overrun the colony of Jarban Minor, killing many of the Imogen Protectorate researchers and infesting many more. Remaining survivors were rescued by Agent Novaterra. So, and then we get into the events of the one-day war like we talked about back during the Terran. And that we'll talk about probably during the Protoss, because we need each side from each one's perspectives. So like we stated, by 2511, Sagar's work on a new Xel'Naga-based species mixing was reaching fruition. Abathur would create a creature known as the Adastra, which were stored in sacs but could generate life passively around them, as the Xel'Naga once did. Sagar then moved on the purified world Gist, and would utilize the Adastra to regenerate the planet. However, the idea of a creature of equal parts Zerg and another being would infuriate Abathur, as his directive was always to have the Zerg be dominant. Abathur also saw Zagar's more peaceful swarm as an affront to everything the swarm stood for, to assimilate all life and bring it into the swarm. Thus, Abathur hatched a plot to destroy the Adastra and spark war between the three wishes. He would steal some Xel'Naga inference and created the Chitha, who followed his commands alone. These creatures could disrupt psionics and communications, as well as command Zerg brutes. He would then modify a queen named Mukov to aid him in his schemes. Abathur's plan was to have the Dominion and Dalim destroy the Adastra, wiping out what he saw as abomination, while triggering a war between the sector's powers. The Dalim would move to Chist, entering the purified planet. Zagar sent Mukov to contact Emperor Valerian Manx. The Emperor would arrive, and Zagar would extend a hand of peace. The two parties were skeptical, however, and agreed on the condition they could send a survey team down to investigate if Zagar's motions for peace were genuine. While the peace talks began smoothly, they They would be interrupted by Abther luring the survey team into an Adastra nest and would begin sending the Chitha at them. Though they defeated the Chitha, they were convinced the Adastra had some connection and would destroy one of the nests. Thus would begin the One-Day War, where Chitha and Chitha-controlled brews fought against Dominion Dalim. Abathur denied the existence of Chitha, and Sagara attempted to figure out what was causing the conflict. She discovered the corpse of Chitha and sent it to the Hyperion via Devourer. Though the second Adastra nest was destroyed, the combined efforts of the Dalim and Dominion prevented destruction of the third and final one. Three factions found Abathur, Gurus, Leviathan, and were able to expose his plot. Chitha was destroyed, and Sagara was subdued by Abathur was subdued by Sagara, but not killed. With the conflict avoided, the Zerg would begin peace talks with Dominion and Dalim and began discussions as to how best to utilize the Adastra to rebuild the Shadowed Realms. So that's the One-Day War, where Abathur tried to basically split the Swarm again and cause war between the Zerg Swarm and the Protoss and the Dominion. Because he doesn't know any other way and didn't want to try and figure out a way. But there would still be tensions between people throughout this, with coming back to Broodmother Nidara, still maintained her purpose to kill all Protoss because of Kerrigan's actions in Heart of Swarm. Despite having never heard Kerrigan's voice again, it would move to the world of Adana to lay a trap for Terran she could use to expand her broods. She would come across the Terran Dominion Renegade salvage group, where she would lease her Zerg on. She would inject the squad's commander with a larva, who would get into a dropship and leave. Meanwhile, she would turn her attention to Terran mercenary Alan's North squad, where she recognized Elms as psionic. Elms, meanwhile, sensed that the Zerg were about to come and attack them. The brood would then be insulted by Protoss under Admiral Arun, who allied with the Terrans in an attempt to save them. After an ambush against the Terrans failed, Arun personally faced down Nidara and she slew him. However, Elms was able to escape the planet in a dropship, and when Nidara attempted to psionically assault the Terran, her squadmate Yong knocked her out. This left Nidara to plot a new plan to end the Protoss. Meanwhile, on Gist, Sagara would sense the rise of Niadra, and pondered what it would mean for the sector at large. Meanwhile, there were other Queens with frigid Zerg space, which would provoke conflict with Terrans situated there, resulting in skirmishes such as the Battle of Camp Pitcairn on Kavir. However, the factions would maintain their relative peace. So in the end, while Sagara would lead the main Zerg swarm, you'd still have broods who, didn't really go along with it all. They would keep fighting, causing conflicts to break out between them and the Dominion and the Protoss. But overall, at the end, everything would be a little bit more peaceful there. So, moving on from history, let's go over the characteristics of the Zerg. So, due to the Terran Confederacy's Project Bellwood and Project Blackstone, a great deal of information would be ascertained as to the nature of the Zerg physiology and psychology. All Zerg breeds are efficient killers and or possess abilities that will aid the swarm in the destruction of its enemies, because the Zerg were designed by Aemon Selnaga to end the Infinite Cycle, so they wanted to use them as weapons. Going over their physiology, the primal Zerg maintained the genome of the Zerg species before the creation of the Overmind, or the original evolutionary strand. The swarm would deviate from the primal counterparts, reducing their physical appearance to essential fighting components. The swarm would excel in proliferation per their high rate of reproduction. The Zerg as a whole, though, are extremely tough, tenacious, and deadly, with their natural armor and weaponry being comparable to modern technology in terms of toughness and armor-piercing capabilities, with their bone armor taking half a dozen gauge rifle rounds before breaking. One-on-one, Zerg are not as strong as Terran and Protoss counterparts, but don't get them in groups, because then, it'd be a bad day for you. The Zerg are extremely resistant to chemical agents, but their biological nature still renders them vulnerable to concentrated radiation, such as Sigma radiation, or when you utilize the radiation beams or spreading thing of the science vessels. I forget what the attack is called right now. So, all Zerg strains can operate in a variety of environments, and some can operate in the vacuum of space, like we spoke about, because the Zerg swarm needed to leave Xeris. Most Zerg are not adapted for space travel by themselves, but can be carried by larger Zergs such as the Leviathans or Behemoths. Spaceborne Zerg either have vast stores of oxygen or have been adapted to not require it, while terrestrial strains are much less dependent on oxygen than other organic creatures and can take a very long time to suffocate. Zerg must eat and rest, but do not require extended hours of sleep and have no set periods of inactivity. Left unchecked, the Zerg would multiply at an alarming rate. And while Zerg strains can gain nutrients from creep, they can also consume other animals for nourishment if the situation demands it. So basically, as long as there's creep, the Zerg can gain nourishment. But if there is none, the Zerg can go back onto the primal instincts of hunting and feeding to get that nourishment. By 2511, plant life generated by Dudastra would provide a substitute for creep for sustenance for some Zerg strains. Zerg do not die of old age, but the Zerg of the swarm will age. Most Zerg ground strains are also capable of burrowing and digging through virtually any surface, utilizing groups of tiny muscles that vibrate at a low frequency to grind dirt and stone along their way, allowing them to essentially swim through the ground. That's why you have in the game, in StarCraft 2 specifically, where you can have your units burrow into the ground and move under the ground itself. Like I believe the roaches, the Zerg, I think some of the Zerglings do. Oh, I can't think right now. It's been a minute since I've played Heart of the Swarm. But yeah. So this ability makes them extremely deadly in ambush situations, as many Terran or Protoss forces could attest to after losing a lot of units. The most interesting aspect is that all Zerg strains, ground strains, would move faster upon creep than they do normal ground due to microscopic filaments within the substance that allow them to essentially skate over it. So think of it like when figure skaters on ice. They're faster with skating with actual ice skates than actually just running on it. So, in a protracted fight, one of the swarm's greatest battlefield advantages is their underground rapid transit system, which they can excavate with amazing speed. During the Great War and the Brood War, this was provided by Nidus canals, but as of the Second Great War, this would be supplanted by Nidus worms spawned from a Nidus network. Zerg also possess remarkable regenerative capabilities. Their alpha amino acids possess unique R groups that allow dead cell matter to be combined with normal proteins to create new cells. Under normal circumstances, Zerg may regenerate indefinitely. Radically changing cell structure is a byproduct of the process, as well as a high quantity of energy in the process. Given time, even a gravely wounded Zerg will return to full health. Thus, a Zerg colony remains viable if even one creature or structure survives. So basically, you want to wipe out everything on the planet, go full extinction mode on the Zerg on that planet, because if one little organism survives, the Zerg as a whole will survive. Though few Zerg survive more than a few minutes in each battle, but those that do evolve during the battle itself, thus becoming more powerful every hour. So basically, this is where you get the stuff of, hey, the Zerg evolve faster and grow, get more stronger the longer they're in a battle, because it will take like seconds to minutes, depending on the different strains they can evolve into, for the Zerg to adapt to a lot of different stuff. So the Zerg constantly study their enemies and adapt accordingly to them. Zerg structures have the ability to adapt well under fire, hardening their outer shell with bony plates when under fire in order to ensure their survival. Zerg structures are essentially giant organs and draw sustenance from the creep, which is a thick carpet-like substance that integrates a colony's structures as one macroorganism. The Zerg are obsessed with detecting subtler motions and more advanced camouflage techniques. So, yeah, the Zerg are pretty terrifying if you let them evolve or survive at any point in time. If you truly want to get rid of them, like I said, go full extermination mode on them. Don't let a single one survive, including their structures, larvae, or any type of Zerg form. But going on to their genetics. Before hatching, a Zerg specimen has two cell types in general. Type A will create random different mutations, while Type B would hunt the new mutations. Upon hatching, the specimen of a certain strain is a result of Darwin's theory of evolution on a cellular level. It is made of the strongest cell mutations that would survive. Or, how Darwin would say only the strongest species survives in the wild. But like Terrans and Protoss, certain genetic material consists of DNA, seemingly in the shape of a double helix. However, when a Zerg strain's DNA evolves, it will become less flexible. Apart from the Overlord, every Zerg strain ever encountered by the Terrans has been a custom mix of DNA, to the extent that no non-Overlord strain bears much genetic resemblance to the organism or organisms that spawned it. A Dr. Talon Ayers theorized that the Zerg are unwilling to too deeply alter the genetic makeup of organisms with psionic potential, as even the slightest of genetic changes can remove said potential. This would, in his mind, explain the genetic similarities in this case. So basically, like we spoke about with the Terrans, in the Terran cast, psionics is a genetic mutation, which I'm not a geneticist. I don't study it too much, but even I know the slightest change of the gene structure can alter the rest of everything in a significant way that can either be bad or can be good or destroy the organism as a whole. So yeah, you don't really want to mess with something that has psionic potential on a genetic level too much, because like I specified, or how Dr. Iyer specified, it will get rid of that psionic potential. And since the Zerg would love to keep their psionic potentials, they don't mess with it too much. So the Zerg like to pick themselves against harsh climates, utilizing those planet's harsh conditions to further their own evolution, to try and be the, just make themselves the strongest and deadliest species there is. In regards to assimilating the genetic material of other species, the Zerg were initially very selective, assimilating only strong species at the top of their food chains and eradicating lesser species lest they corrupt the purity of the Zerg genome. This is when they were back on Xeris as the primal Zerg. Strongest will survive, and if that thing is strongest at the food chain, I am going to take its features, because then I could become stronger. And you know what? I don't care a bit about any other lesser species. They can die for all I care. That is how the primal Zerg think. But under Kerrigan, the situation would change, and the Zerg were willing to assimilate any material they would come across. Basically, hey, everything has something we can utilize, so let's utilize it. No ifs, ands, or buts. Everything is useful. The Zerg genetic landscape is constantly changing to the extent we're using the terms such as mutant, mutation being a permanent change to an organism's genetic code, can be considered to be a misnomer. So, yeah, you can't really call it like, hey, it's a mutant because it gained that one trait. No, the Zerg have a adaptable genome that would let them to get any mutation at any time that they need it, because they have to adapt to the changing rhythm and flow of battle/life so that they do not die and can always be on top. So, yeah. Zerg DNA would be antithetical to Protoss DNA, as they cannot infest the Protoss under normal conditions. In addition to that, Protoss psionic powers, i.e. the Kala and the Void, would protect the Protoss from being infected. Thus, the Protoss are the only known species that the Zerg have failed to assimilate. However, their DNA can be artificially combined, creating hybrids. We'll touch on them later in a different cast, probably. Yeah, so the Zerg will infest and assimilate anything else but the Protoss due to, if you haven't guessed it yet, Zelnaga. The Zelnaga made it so that the Protoss can't be infested. Yay! Good on the Protoss. A little bit poor for the Terrans, though, because the Zerg love to eat Terrans for some ungodly reason. Poor us. If only we were unable to be assimilated and infested. Curse you, Zelnaga. Give us the stuff as well. So, psychology of the Zerg. It has been difficult for observers to determine the full extent of the Zerg intelligence, but it is clear that they are a very cunning species and capable of higher reasoning. Yeah, higher reasoning. I mean, true, we see that a lot with the primal Zerg and with the added mutations that Kerrigan would add to the other brood mothers become more intelligent. Yeah, they would become that. Although they do not utilize technology, they demonstrate a clear understanding of it and have been known to open airlocks and doorways in colonies that they have raided. As a group, they also react intelligently to attacks and are adept at tactical combat. On an individual basis, though, the Zerg seem to be hardly more than savage animals with little or no concern for self-preservation, exhibiting no initiative. Evolution is directed by alpha Zerg strains such as Cerebrids, Queens, Abathur, Broodmothers, and Kerrigan. Dr. Talise Kogan voiced the idea that the Zerg, as a whole, can be considered to be a macroorganism, or basically one giant body controlled by a entity, i.e. Kerrigan, the Overmind, Zagara, Amon, or basically a slave race to them. As a united body, the Zerg have been known to execute advanced combat tactics, setting up ambushes using burrowed units to disguise their ranks, or using layered defensive lines like the infamous Juno lines to draw out armored columns. Generally, communication between members of the Swarm is done psionically, although higher command strains can process and understand vocal commands. After the end war, vocal and non-psionic communication became more commonly utilized by the Zerg Swarm. Because, Zagara wanted to maintain peace with the other two factions, and since the Terrans can't really communicate psionically much, she would have to utilize non-psionic communication. So, fun times always when you get into peace talks with a species that loves to eat people and transform. Just like the Tyranids from K. Ayo! Okay, moving on. For the Zerg, success on the battlefield comes down to overwhelming numbers and great mobility. For them, war is simply survival of the fittest. It is deemed mission critical by Terran Dominion that Zerg spawning centers be targeted as soon as tactically possible, for while the Zerg can multiply at an alarming rate, their production of strains is centralized. Hence, the Zerg will protect their hatcheries with fanatical zeal. Quest for protection is rooted deep within the Zerg psyche and is a pseudo-religious concept for them. The core idea of this religion is that they're the state that the Zerg can reach where they would no longer need to evolve, and that their evolutionary form would never have to change again because they could already adapt to any situation. The Zerg have the ability to sense psychic power and, being sensitive to it, often respond to it, to the point of rendering themselves temporarily out of the control of a leader, and would seek it out. This ability has a greater range than that of Wranglers, which are psionic agents within the Terran Dominion Confederacy, or seek younger psionic children to bring to schools. Weakly psychic Terrans employed to find other psychics. Like I said, in rare cases, the Zerg's hive mind does communicate by means of Terrans understand, often referring to themselves as we. Those undergoing infestation are begging to be brought into their collective, welcoming them as the us. Control, amount of control exerted over Zerg force also impacts on their intelligence. Without this control, the Zerg will be little more than animals attacking everything on sight, at times even their own kind. These Zerg are referred to as feral Zerg and can generally only operate at the lowest level. In contrast, primal Zerg are individuals with no links to a hive mind. During the Brood War, the Queen of Blades became the uncontested leader of the Swarm. However, creating sapient lieutenants such as Brood Mothers extended her control over the Swarm even further. Zerg can be lobotomized. To lose contact with the Zerg Swarm, Terran Dominion would conduct this experiment as early as 2500 using Zerglings to seek psychic terrors. So basically, the Zerg of the Swarm need to have a controlling intelligence, or they will not be as smart and capable as the feral Zerg, who are still considered individuals. This is the one thing about hive mind species that people never look without a central controlling consciousness or entity that, puts control over them. These hive mind species will normally fall apart into feral or comatose-like states. So that's the one thing that the primal Zerg hated about the Zerg Swarm. Warp travel. Basically, Zerg are able to create rifts in the warp space to transport themselves at fast light speeds. These rifts would be utilized multiple times, and they utilize these with the Leviathans and Behemoth ships mostly that I can remember. If anybody knows of any other species of Zergs that can utilize these warp rifts or warp travel, please message me on the Discord. Would love to hear. I'm always excited to learn more stuff or new things that I don't know about StarCraft. So, yeah. Shameless plug of the Discord. Succeeded. The Zerg have demonstrated an ability to storm worlds, but are less well equipped at holding them. After the Brood War, the Swarm would pull back to Char, but could have easily expanded to cover numerous worlds again. We know of over 100 worlds infested by the Zerg between the Brood War and the Second Great War. But before they invade a planet, Zerg fleets typically drop a massive payload of hive spores to seed the surface. Through the infestation process, the Zerg can convert entire planetary biosystems into an extension of their wills. Sorry, excuse me. So, yeah, the Zerg are adept at invading planets, not too much at controlling them or maintaining control of them, if they meet a force that is capable of fighting back, i.e. the Terrans and the Protoss. If it's a primitive species, then yeah, they can maintain control of the world and simulate that. Hell, even technically, the Terran have been able to kick off Zerg off their own worlds that were conquered early on and regain back control of those planets. Though it would take a long time because they'd have to hunt down every single Zerg and Creep and Zerg hive cluster and get rid of it because, like I stated earlier, if you leave one Zerg alive, they will come back. And it's not a fun time for anybody when they come back. So, couple of notes that we know about. Many Zerg breeds have a pair of mandibles on the side of their mouths that can close together to form a mouth guard of sorts. Examples would include the Hydralis, the Lurker, and the Queen. Most other breeds have some form of tusk or mandibles on or near their mouths. The Haka, a primal Zerg, would also possess these. Queen and brood mothers possess movable cheek mandibles, but do not have actual mouths that they will utilize. In the original StarCraft, Zerg unit sounds are meant to convey the sense of Zerg talking, even though the words aren't actually being said. Development. Here's the original thing from the developer notes on Zerg. If the Protoss were the hyper-advanced aliens of StarCraft, and the Terran were its rough and tumble space cowboys, the Zerg were the savage monsters of the universe, the bugs and beasts that would exist only to kill or spread their infestation. So the original conception of the Zerg in StarCraft Alpha had been named Nightmarish Invaders and later Zerg with a U. This was later changed to Zerg with an E to avoid legal action from Pixar as per the character of Emperor Zurg from Toy Story. Gotta love copyright claims and whatnot. Always messes everybody up. In the Alpha, the Zerg were a race of biomechanical creatures. Is Samwise Didier, ah, man, has commented about the biomechanical idea has arguably come full circle as a StarCraft 2, where by the end of the game, various infested mechanical units were utilized by the Zerg, such as the infested Banshee, the infested siege tanks, infested bunker, when the infested Terran faction would come about in the co-op campaign under Stukov. So, yeah, looks like they wanted to start as a biomechanical race, ended up becoming a purely biological race that would evolve, and then in the end would actually become that because of the infestation of Terrans and their structures and units. Yeah, so I guess they came full circle. So it was decided early on that the Zerg would literally swarm their enemies. They were originally conceived as a teeth and feral rage, the dark side of evolution. Sharks were utilized as a point of reference in the original conception, taking flight to hunt humans from the sky. The name Nightmare Invaders was retained for the freeware version of StarCraft Loomings on its victory screen. Alongside the Terrans and Protoss, the Zerg aesthetic was decided early on in the development of StarCraft that their structures would be spiky, almost triangular. The triangular aspect came from Samwise Dider, applying shape language theory to the three races, with the Zerg structures being triangles, the Terran squares, and the Protoss structures being elliptical. The Zerg were developed concurrently alongside the Protoss. However, the Zerg underwent more revision than their counterpart in the original game. Blizzard frequently let its artists hold jam sessions to find the right look for the creatures. The Hydralis actually became the basis of the Zerg after its reveal, namely that the Zerg would be a purely organic race, the look and feel being hard chitinous plates and supple muscular flesh with lots of sharp points. In the original game, most of the Zerg sound effects were generated by Glenn Stafford, and during development of Brood War, a number of Zerg sets were developed. These were a mix of crustaceans, mammals, and cat-looking things. During development of StarCraft 2, the developers focused on the elements they liked, such as using overlapping plates and adjusting the ratio of toothiness to glowing puzzles to tentacly bits. Moving along into the different inspirations of the Zerg, because, everybody else. Artists are always inspired by others to create new things out of what they've seen. It happens in every franchise. You can't blame anybody for doing it. Unless you blatantly rip off a aspect, and then we can blame you for doing that. In terms of visual design, the Zerg have drawn inspirations from many sources, ranging from other works of science fiction, such as the Alien series, to deep-sea biology. Prevailing science fiction theme for the Zerg in terms of inspiration was the idea of parasites assimilating their host. Alien and Starship Troopers were among the most significant influence. In the case of the latter, Zerg standing in for arachnids and mods, assaulting fortified Terran positions in a manner similar to the 97 film, are very common. Ender's Game has also been cited as an influence, though I don't know exactly where, probably due to the main enemy insect-like species, probably. And the Zerg have also been compared to the Borg from Star Trek due to their assimilation. So, here's the rumor that I found, or the thing. The rumor came about that StarCraft was supposed to be a Warhammer 40k game and that the Zerg were inspired by the Tyranids from 40k. Listen to this. According to the StarCraft concept artist Max Marshall, he had no knowledge of the 40k franchise when designing the Zerg and based their designs off his interest in comic books. Similarly, Bob Fish had stated that he had not heard of K until after StarCraft was shipped, after which a rumor would begin to circulate that StarCraft was based on the IP, or that Blizzard was originally contracted out to build a Warhammer 40k RTS game. That was all just a rumor. These guys had no idea of 40k or the Tyranids when they originally released StarCraft. So, let's just toss that rumor out of the way. While I would originally like it, after doing more research, hey, this actually didn't happen. But Samurai Snyder would give us a little bit on how the design process would go. The Zerg design process can summed up as follows. 1. You start with lots of teeth. 2. You would choose a troop type. A melee attacker, a ranged attacker, a flying attacker, or all of the above. Game designers didn't like this option as it's too multi-purpose. You would pick a form, a decapod, a hexapod, an octopod, or a serpentine form. Add 2 or more of the followings: poisonous spines, or teeth, barbed tails, jagged claws, spiked back plates, insectoid wings, venomous tendrils, bat wings, acidic glands, or a lot more teeth. You would choose a name prefix: rage, omega, spore, ravage, blade, destruct, terror, any word that would sound violent and excludes overall nastiness. And then you would choose a suffix: ling, list, tor, zor, etc. So, Zerg, ling, Hydra, Lisk, not the door. I'm thinking the wrong stuff. But yeah, that's the basic design process they would go for. So, but this would be the Zerg, one of our favorite factions within StarCraft, who would go on to invade and infest our hearts with their likeness. That plus all the extra stuff that they would do for just the animations for it within StarCraft 2 or not, making them look like puppies. How that one circling acted like a puppy during Heart of the Swarm with Kerrigan. But in the end, I hope you all learned something new about the Zergs as a whole, about where they came from, how they evolved into what they are, and where they ended up going. And maybe we'll hopefully see more on where they end up now, because there are rumors about a new StarCraft shooter coming out. But hopefully we learn more at BlizzCon this year about where the Zerg are heading to now. Hope you all enjoyed it. Hope to see you all next week when we continue on with the arc of the races. And my name is Jeremy, and I'll see you all in the next cast. Bye-bye now.